Before beginning this lecture on the subject of counterterrorism and the nascence of extreme right-wing movements in Algeria, in the waning days of French rule in 1954 to 1962, I have some sad news to convey. Plato is dead, Socrates is dead, and I'm not feeling too well myself. First of all, I am sure that you would all like to know who I am. Who is Alexander Harrison? And what was the concatenation of events which led him to become an authority on the subject in question? In brief, I grew up in a drafty waterfront town in Long Island, Port Washington, and my social origins are modest. My father was a butler for the wealthy families in Sands Point, and my mother was a chambermaid. Both had emigrated from Great Britain, part of the great wave of foreign immigration to these shores after the Great War of 1914 and 1918. Like many of their contemporaries from Old Blighty, they hoped that their children would achieve the success that had eluded them. In these photos, you see me in my formative years. Then we see Alexander Harrison in Paris in 1961, descending the Boulevard Saint-Michel, the Boule Mich. I was in Paris on a graduate scholarship which my alma mater, Tulane University, had offered me, a scholarship to the Sorbonne. Then one sees photos of me as an aspiring model, followed by several snapshots taken on the set of the film Lafayette, which became one of the most expensive flops in the history of the cinema. Let me set the scene for you. It is the Battle of Yorktown, the decisive engagement of the Revolutionary War. The great English actor Jack Hawkins, whom I played near opposite to, assumed the role of General Cornwallis. Hawkins, as Cornwallis, sees in the distance soldiers whom he can't identify. They are neither redcoats nor Continentals. Playing the role of a British Army courier, I gallop up on my steed to announce that the Rangers of Lafayette, sir. Lafayette, that damn boy, exclaimed Hawkins. Finally, there's a snapshot of me as a Merchant Marine staff officer during the Vietnam War, dressed in my summer whites, followed by several photos of me in my winter uniform while still on active duty. There's also a photo of a little dog, several photos actually, whom my wife and I befriended while on assignment in Bouquet, Guinea for USAID. In addition to being a professional model, actor, animal rights activist, I am also an academician and an indefatigable researcher, as my field research indicates. I have my BA from Tulane University, the Harvard of the South, as well as 3 master's degrees in French, political science, and philosophy in that order, and a PhD in history from New York University on the subject of the Maghreb. Moreover, among the other awards, there is a certificate from Skydive Long Island for static line parachute jumps, a real challenge, as well as a letter of thanks from the Hoover Institution in California, to which I have donated all of the primary source material which I gathered in the course of my field research on the subject of French Algeria. Finally, one sees 2 certificates of commendation for my service as a Fulbright scholar in Senegal, as well as a personal letter from President Barack Obama in recognition of my volunteer work in West Africa under the auspices of USAID. So there you have it, a full-dimensional portrait of Alexander Harrison and his achievements. I also have 3 entries in the card catalog for books which I have written in Algeria, to which I will refer in the course of the lecture. The chain of events which led me to become involved as a scholar and as a writer in the struggle to save French Algeria are as follows. First, I was there in France in the final years of the conflict and was an eyewitness to some of the spillover effects of the war being waged at that time on the other side of the Mediterranean. One example, there was an Algerian Jew, Jacques Romoli, who owned a haberdashery store in Paris in the 7e arrondissement, and who had refused to pay a tax imposed by various counter-terrorist groups in Algeria, which in essence amounted to a form of extortion. His store was bombed and then bombed again when he refused to pay the tax. And so it went. Second, I had been a French miner at Tulane and had a deep reverence for French culture and was struck by the dilemma of the French in Algeria, the Pieds Noirs settlers, and their Francophile Muslim allies who faced an Algerian Muslim Liberation Front, the Front de Libération Nationale, or the FLN, which sought its independence from France, on the one hand, and on the other hand, opposition from their own government, which as of 1959, under Charles de Gaulle, made it clear that the government in metropolitan France and Paris also favored self-determination for Algeria's Muslim majority. Third, in addition to having a weakness for lost causes and the survival of the Pieds Noirs minority in Algeria seen by 1960 to be extremely problematic, I also experienced the rigors of the French penal system. During my stay in France, which turned out to be both a mind-broadening and mind-bending experience, while at the Prison FLN, I made the acquaintance of a notorious French underworld figure, Joseph Attia, or Joe Tia for short. Attia had reformed, we are 1963, and become a spook or barbouze for the government, and was responsible for bringing to justice Antoine Algou, an OAS colonel who had deserted and fled to Munich after the fall of French Algeria. Attia, who had special privileges, came into our cell one day, cradling a bottle of Ricard, pastis, and offered us all a drink, which was strictly against prison regulations. Thus, he had special privileges from the prison warden. Having given you my autobiographical elements, let us revenir au mouton, return to the subject under discussion, which has been my principal preoccupation for a number of years, the rise of extreme right-wing movements and counter-terrorist groups which marked the final years of French rule in Algeria. These were the self-proclaimed ultras, and whose reason for being was the defense of Algeria as an integral part of France. From Dunkirk in northern France to Tamanrasset, the southern border of Algeria, this was more than a slogan of these true believers. It was an article of faith. These highly conservative movements in Algeria recruited in large part downscale proletarian whites, les petits blancs, who made up the majority of the European population, and who in many cases had never seen the motherland, metropolitan France. The petits blancs, or proletarian whites, lived in poor, impoverished neighborhoods with names such as Babelwed, Clos-Salanguier in Algiers, and the Quartier de la Marine in Oran, Algiers' other major city, and who felt most threatened by the above-mentioned FLN, which was out to kill them and drive them from their birthplace. The proletarian whites, many of whom had served in the French army, were joined in their last-ditch struggle by increasing numbers of foreign legionnaires for whom Algeria had been home, as well as by certain rogue officers and NCOs of the army of Algeria, who had spent their careers defending the empire and did not want to see this outpost of that empire lost. The series of events that brought the issue to its crisis point was the return to power of the man of 18 June, Charles de Gaulle, who, having been invested as the last prime minister of the moribund Fourth Republic and then elected to the presidency of the Fifth Republic in 1960, reversed his previous position in favor of French Algeria and began to offer the Arab majority there the option of becoming independent. What was particularly galling for the army of Algeria, the Pieds Noirs, and the Francophile Muslims, the Français Musulmans, was that de Gaulle had promised just the opposite several years before. In a tour of Algeria in 1958, de Gaulle declared in a speech which he gave in the city of Mostaganem, "Vive l'Algérie française!" Yet a year later, here was Big Charlie, as the old daily news called him. He stood 6'10", going back in his pledge and offering to the worst enemies of the army, the Pieds Noirs and the Francophile Muslims, the FLN, offering independence to the FLN, which independence meant that the army would have fought and sacrificed for nothing, and that the above-mentioned Pieds Noirs and the Francophile Muslims would be the victims of a sellout by their very own government. The first épreuve de force, or confrontation between the adversarial parties, the partisans of French Algeria and the Élysée Palace of the metropolitan government in Paris, was the Barricades uprising in January 1960 in the streets of Algiers, spearheaded by a local restaurateur and a roughneck by the name of Joseph Ortiz, or l'Oncle Joe, as he was known to his friends. Ortiz and the militants of his patriotic movement, the Front National Français, or the French National Front, believed mistakenly that a show of force by his street troops and the army of Algeria against de Gaulle's offer of self-determination for the FLN would force the chief of state to renounce his proposal and reaffirm his earlier commitment to keeping Algeria within the French orbit. Hélas, it was not to be. The army of Algeria, in which those loyal to de Gaulle, or at least loyal to their careers, outnumbered the rogue elements ready to cross the Rubicon and support Ortiz's street uprising, did not appear en masse in the streets of Algiers to support the bistro owner. And following a fusillade with the local policeman of Gare Mobile, in which lives were lost, Ortiz fled Algeria for Spain, where he settled into more or less permanent exile. Ortiz was never to see his birthplace, Algeria, again. For the true believers in French Algeria, the Barricades uprising represented the last real chance to forestall the seemingly inevitable march towards independence. And when the army of Algeria, for diverse reasons, failed to support wholeheartedly the Barricades uprising, the partisans of French Algeria knew in their heart of hearts that the end of French rule in Algeria was only a matter of time. Here you see Ortiz during the Barricades uprising, when he was at the pinnacle of his power and influence. To his left, the second photo is Pierre Poujade, a local attorney and veteran paratrooper who headed a redoubt during the week of the Barricades in support of Ortiz. I caught up with Ortiz in Toulon in 1978 after he and other activists had been amnestied by de Gaulle. In this photo, one sees Ortiz with his wife on his right, and Edouard Slama, an ex-paratrooper who had fought the Algerian FLN, the Jebel or Hills of Algeria, and then returned to Algiers to join the ranks of the counter-terrorists when it became clear that de Gaulle was determined to give Algeria away to the FLN. But Ortiz had been involved in Algerian politics even before the Barricades uprising, and was linked to the freelance killings of FLN militants in the Arab Kasbah after November 1st, 1954, when the Arabs revolted, which killings were in retaliation for the bombings of cafes and restaurants frequented by Pieds Noirs, by the equipe of Yassif Saadi. Ortiz's group, the FNF, was only one of many patriotic movements which emerged in response to the crisis caused by the above-mentioned Arab revolt. There were others with names such as Garde le Drapeau, Guardians of the Flag, Résurrection Patrie, Resurrection of the Fatherland, Front l'Algerie Française, French Algerian Front, among others. However, the most fearsome and lethal of these social movements, which embraced the concept of French Algeria, and which represented an amalgamation of all the other like-minded cells mentioned above, was the Organisation Armée Secrète, OAS, or Secret Army Organization, which came into being in April 1961 in the wake of the collapse of the general's putsch. How best to explain the origins and the reasons for the emergence of the OAS? Perhaps the simplest way of explaining its emergence is through the following equation. De Gaulle plus the war in Algeria equaled the OAS. First, there was the Arab revolt, which broke out in the region of the Ores Nementia, in the eastern part of the country on November 1st, 1954, All Saints' Day, or as the Pieds Noirs came to call it, Bloody All Saints' Day, or La Toussaint Rouge, because of the violence unleashed by the Algerian Mujahideen, or Jundi, against the French establishment on that day. An essential characteristic of the strategy of terrorism, because it is after all a strategy of warfare, is coordination. And the first days of the revolt were characterized by a series of coordinated attacks by the FLN's guerrilla army in communes, districts, and rural areas which the French authorities had left under-administered for decades. What is noteworthy about these first days of the revolt is that its first victims were not the French settlers, but rather the Francophile Muslims who occupied within the French administration posts either as caïds or magistrates, officers and soldiers in the army of Algeria, or even as forest rangers, the gardes champêtres. Oui, mesdames et messieurs, even Francophile forest rangers were the victims of the not-so-tender mercies of the FLN killers. Of all the victims of the war, it was the Francophile Muslims who suffered the most, not only during the war, but also during its sanguinary aftermath. The Arab revolt that broke out on All Saints' Day did not take the Pieds Noirs settlers entirely by surprise. Algeria under French rule, which began in the 1820s, had always been an apex of tension, since the relationship between the Arabs and the French army and the settlers had always been one of the les vainqueurs et les vaincus, the conquerors and the conquered. And throughout the period of French sovereignty there, 1820-25 to 1962, there were periodic revolts against the rule of the Roumi, as the Algerians called their French overlords. The most recent rebellion against French rule before the events of All Saints' Day was a massacre that took place in 1945 in the region of Sétif, led by a charismatic nationalist who called himself Messali Hadj, and whose followers were known as Messalistes. The Messalistes took up arms against the French presence in Sétif, and the result was the pillaging of farms belonging to the Pieds-Noirs, the slaughtering of livestock, and the deaths of roughly 30 settlers, including women and children. The retaliation by French foreign legionnaires and Senegalese infantrymen fighting for France was far more sanguinary. It is estimated that over 10,000 lives were lost among the ranks of the Messalistes. The background to the Messalistes' revolt is not difficult to fathom. France had been defeated in World War II and occupied for 4 years by the Third Reich. In the eyes of its subject peoples, it had lost face and was therefore vulnerable. The actions of Messali Hadj and his militant followers were among the first in a concatenation of events that left the French of Algeria anxious and fearful about their future. A second event that fed their apprehensions was the defeat of the French Expeditionary Corps in Indochina by the troops of the Viet Minh, headed by Giap, the commander-in-chief, and his political guru, Ho Chi Minh. And the French were forced to withdraw from this protectorate in Southeast Asia, where they had been present for decades. The next knock on the door of misfortune, as it were, for the French, the Francophile Muslims, was the decision by the French National Assembly under the premiership of Pierre Poujade to grant independence to the North African protectorates of Morocco and Tunisia in 1956. Morocco had 600,000 Pieds-Noirs, or French settlers, and Tunisia had over 200,000. The settlers, therefore, in Algeria wondered whether they would be the next domino to fall, whether the end of the colonial tradition for France was imminent. Although the Arab revolt began in the east, in the mountainous region of the OAS, it quickly spread westward, and in 1956 we witnessed the implantation of an FLN cell in Algiers called the Autonomous Zone of Algiers, or la Zone Autonome d'Alger, headed by Lalbi Ben Mehdi, one of the founding fathers of the Algerian Revolution. After his capture and execution by the French authorities, Ben Mehdi was succeeded by his adjoint or deputy Yassif Sadi, and was infiltrated into the FLN network in the Arab Kasbah in Algiers as events were unfolding. Sadi's strategy was to strike the French in the capital city, where they were most vulnerable. Sadi recruited young Muslim women, some of whom were university students, to become poseuses de bombe. They were given orders to enter cafes frequented by Pieds-Noirs, order a drink, and then before leaving, place a tote bag or Air France bag under the table, which contained a bomb. The result was a series of coordinated explosions throughout Algiers, resulting in multiple deaths and injuries. The security situation deteriorated to the point that the socialist government of Guy Mollet sent in the 10th Paratroop Division under General Jacques Massieu to extirper le mal, to eliminate the FLN wave of terrorist bombings by any means necessary, which meant that the paratroop officers under Massieu were given the green light to use extra-legal methods of interrogation. This is to say, the employment of the use of the GGN, or electrodes attached to a suspect's body to force him to talk, as well as la noyade simulée, or waterboarding, the object of which was to force a confession. Aspects of these enhanced interrogation techniques can be seen in the film La Bataille d'Alger, directed by Gilles Pontecorvo and shot on location in 1965, that is to say, in the city of Algiers. Sadi, who played himself in the film, was finally captured and his terrorist network dismantled. For various reasons, among which the fact that Sadi had been at one point a police informer, he gained early release from custody, leading some of his critics to accuse him of having betrayed his comrades under arms in return for special favors from the government. I interviewed Sadi in 1990 in his home, a majestic White House in the heights of Algiers, in one of the city's most exclusive neighborhoods. Sadi, by this time, had become a wealthy man. He served us tea, chai, in porcelain cups with gold teaspoons. Although gracious, he avoided answering questions about his past history, allegedly as a police informant, and refused to answer allegations made by others that he had, in the course of his career, tourné Kazakh, or become a turncoat, and a qui pro quo worked out with the French government. Among the casualties of the FLN's revolution in Algeria were Algeria's Jews, who with increasing frequency after 1954 became the victims of FLN assassins, which was due, in part, to the fact that whereas Jews in Algeria had been given French citizenship during the first years of the Third Republic in the 1870s, the same privileges were not extended to Muslims. As one ex-Caïd explained to me, before the passage of the Premier Decree, which guaranteed French citizenship for Jews without obliging them to renounce their religion, Jews and Muslims had been cousins. Afterwards, the worm was in the fruit. Le ver était dans le fruit. During the final years of French sovereignty in Algeria, there was still a sizable Jewish community in the city of Constantine in the eastern part of the country. Relations with their Muslim neighbors were by and large harmonious, despite the passage of the Premier Decree, or citizenship given to Algeria's Jews. In this community, there was a chanteur of Jewish extraction by the name of Raymond Laris, called the Sheikh, who interpreted the ancient music of Andalusia with his orchestra, Malouf. If there was one thing that brought the two communities together, it was music. And the orchestra of Laris was extremely popular in both the Arab and Jewish communities of this city. One day, while Laris was doing the shopping in the local marketplace, he was shot in the back of the neck by an FLN triggerman. Consternation followed, and virtually the entire Jewish community of Constantine, sensing the impending danger and fearful of FLN terror, made plans to leave, to emigrate, primarily to France. If Laris, a man who only wanted to play his music, could fall victim to the Mujahideen, then no one was safe. The ethnic cleansing of Constantine, which was the goal of the FLN, became, within a brief period of time, an accomplished fact. The killing of Laris illustrated one salient fact about the strategy of FLN terrorism, the fact that the victim, in this case the singer Raymond Laris, was not necessarily offensive or dangerous to the revolution, but merely a member of his distinctive group that the FLN hoped to drive from the country, and they were successful. When I visited Algeria for the first time in 1979, I encountered only a handful of Algerian Jews who had opted to remain. Virtually all were aged and living in nursing homes and cared for by Catholic nuns. The killing of Laris also illustrated the FLN's ultimatum to all French citizens: la valise ou le cercueil, the suitcase or the coffin. Allow me to add one footnote to what I said about the Premier Decree, which allowed Algeria's Jews to become French citizens without having to renounce their religion. But how many Muslims in Algeria during the period of French colonization would have dared to commit an act of apostasy by renouncing Islam and adopting Christianity? As noted above, it was the proletarian whites living in close proximity to their Arab counterparts who felt that they would have the most to lose in the event of an Algerian FLN victory and independence, and who reacted the most violently to the possible change in the status quo. Ironically, many of them had been rank-and-file members of the Communist Party when the party supported the status quo, But when the Parti Communiste took a stand against imperialism in general, and French Algeria in particular, many petits blancs joined the ranks of the counter-terrorists. Among the first volunteers to the ad hoc counter-terrorist groups that eventually became part of the OAS was Joseph Ritza, nicknamed Nani or Joe le Vengeur, and considered by others whom I interviewed to be one of the most efficient of the gunmen to take up arms against the FLN. I caught up with Ritza years after the struggle had ended, when he was working at a radio station in Draguignan in southeast France. Ritza's reputation as Le Vengeur was merited. He had been part of virtually every major military operation which the OAS had taken credit for, including the mortar attack bombardment on Muslims in the Place du Gouvernement in March 1962, when all was coming to an end, an operation that cost the lives of dozens of Muslims. He was also part of the équipe that launched the raid against the social centers in Algiers at Château Royal, which ended the lives of Muslim notables, including that of the famous Algerian writer and friend of Albert Camus and Emmanuel Robles, Mouloud Ferroun. OAS operatives had their own military jargon. An assassination was called an opération ponctuelle, or OP, and to faire un bailleur meant basically the same thing. A botched operation would be called faire une banane, or to slip on a banana peel, or une anomalie. Ritza was not the only OAS desperado who was trigger-happy. Since I interviewed over 50 of these sportsmen for the purpose of my dissertation and books on the subject, allow me to draw for you, listeners, portraits of some of the others. There was Paul Monsiat, also known as Paul Longcheveux, a gunman from the popular port of Bab el-Oued, who headed a Delta Commando unit of between 7 or 8 killers, who sought out the usual suspects: liberals, FLN terrorists, Gaullist spooks or barbouzes, and basically anyone who disagreed with the thesis of French Algeria. I tracked Monsiat down when he was living in what is called HLM, Habitation à Loyer Modéré, or projects, in the city of Cavaillon in southern France, where he was living with his wife and children and a little dog, a mutt whom they had adopted and named Soutan. My interview with Monsiat is included in both the hardback and softback editions of my book, Challenging de Gaulle. Then there was François Lecat, alias Fanfan, a Corsican with ties to the local Algiers underworld. It is said that if you are born Corsican, there are only 2 possible career paths. You either become a gangster or a policeman, or sometimes both. Lecat, veteran of the paratroop regiment, had a friend in Algiers at the time, a fellow Corsican and army buddy by the name of Dominique Fondacci. Fondacci owned a bistro, Son de la Guitare, but he was also a police informer, and therefore an enemy of the OAS. Lecat, to join the OAS, was ordered to kill Fondacci, his best friend. If he had not, there were other OAS gunmen who would be waiting to kill him. When we met for lunch in a restaurant in Toulouse in 1979, Lecat confided to me that each time he carried out an assassination, it was though in destroying others, you destroyed a part of yourself. Lecat also confided that even 15 years afterwards, he had never been able to shed his reputation as an assassin. He remained a man tormented by his past. Among the most folkloric and reckless of the OAS desperados whom I interviewed while doing my research in Alicante, Spain, where many of the gunmen had fled to after the fall of French Algeria, there was a certain Jésus Giner, also known as Jésus de Bab el-Oued, a taxi driver by day and OAS assassin by night. Giner typified the ambiguity that existed between among the gunmen, between the classes dangereuses and les classes laborieuses. Giner was involved in one of the more atrocious episodes of the War of the Shadows, as it was called, the killing of a certain William Levi, a Socialist Party official and supporter of the FLN, who lived at the time in Bab el-Oued, a hotbed of right-wing extremism. Giner received an order, a bulletin de renseignement en BR, to kill a certain William Levi. In the words of one eyewitness source, Giner simply looked in the phone book to find the address of the victim. according to the same eyewitness. The annoying thing was that there were 6 people by the name of Levi living in Algiers. Jesus killed 3 of them before he came upon the William Levi in question. Jesus could not be bothered with details. Jesus was trigger-happy. There was also Louis Bertolini, alias Captain Benoit, who was a double agent and who worked for the equivalent in France of the CIA, Service de Documentation Extérieure et de Contre-Espionnage, or SEDEC for short, and who was an OAS sympathizer. Benoit knew in advance the names and dates of arrival in Algiers of the Gaullist spooks or barbouzes sent from Paris to dismantle the OAS, and he would subsequently transmit the information to the organization. The result was that when the Gaullist agents would be targeted and gunned down by OAS squads as they came out of the airport in Algiers, Maison Blanche. Another OAS recruit was André Canal, alias Black Monocle, a businessman with contacts throughout the country, and he was able to lay his hands on quantities of explosives, a portion of which he supplied to the OAS, and a portion which he kept himself, reserving the right to set up bombs anywhere he chose. Jean-Jacques Sizini, head of political action and propaganda for the OAS, described Canal to me as an operative who would take a bomb with a lighted fuse and stroll through entire cities looking for an opportunity to explode it. In Sizini's own words, Canal adored seeing things explode. Sizini added that people like Canal, you can't ask them for anything, because if you do, you have to put up with them afterwards. Canal was a troubled soul. The growing anxiety of the European population in Algeria, the Quinois, as of the beginning of the Arab Revolt, coincided with a crise de conscience among certain officers and NCOs, what was called la réserve opérationnelle, the regular French army and the Legion. These soldiers had spent almost their entire careers defending the empire, and for them the defense of Algeria was the last line of defense, the last stand, and they were willing to go all out, even to the point of supporting a revolt against their own government, led by de Gaulle, who they believed had betrayed them. As noted above, this was the same army that had suffered successive defeats since the beginning of World War II, beginning with the occupation of France by the Third Reich in 1940, followed by setbacks in Indochina in 1954 and Suez in 1956. It was an army that was demoralized, yet determined to save face by preserving French sovereignty in Algeria, which, as they never failed to remind themselves, had the status not of a colony or a protectorate, but was an extension of France proper. As noted above, from Dunkerque to Tamanrasset was more than a slogan, it was an article of faith. Early in 1961, General Raoul Salon, former commander-in-chief of French forces in Indochina and then Algeria, before being removed from his post by de Gaulle, joined the general's putsch in April of the same year, in a last-ditch effort to reverse the course of history and prevent de Gaulle from giving Algeria away to the FLN. Following the collapse of the putsch, which was ill-conceived and lacked popular support, Saddam became a clandestin and went underground to join the OAS, which was then being formed. Of the 4 generals who were the standard bearers of the putsch of April 1961, literally a last-ditch effort to overthrow de Gaulle and install a new regime in power to keep Algeria French, only Salon Jouot decided to continue the fight, whereas Zéléon Charles, the other 2 generals involved in the junta, gave themselves up to the not-so-tender mercies of Gaullist justice. Salon, following the collapse of the putsch, was escorted secretly from the forum in Algiers, from which the putschist generals had addressed the throngs of Quinois during the days that the putsch seemed to have a chance of succeeding. And he was taken to the property of a right-wing farmer with vast holdings in the Matijda, which is the agricultural breadbasket of Algeria, a right-wing farmer by the name of Robert Martel. Martel was living proof that political theories and ideas that had become moribund in France took on a new life when they crossed the Mediterranean. Martel called himself the Chouan, after the monarchist armies who initiated the White Terror in the Vendée region of France in the late 18th century to oppose the Revolution of 1789. Martel believed that France's true vocation was to be a Catholic monarchy. For the length of time that Salon was at Martel's farm, he was kept a virtual prisoner. Finally, after several months, he managed to escape back to Algiers, where he assumed the position of Supreme Commander of the OAS. Jouot, on the other hand, the only one of the four generals to have actually been born in Algeria, thus a Pied Noir, was taken by friends to Oran following the collapse of the putsch, where he directed the actions of the OAS death squads from a hideout in a high-rise, the Panoramique, which overlooked the waterfront of Mers el-Kebir. I interviewed Salon in his palatial, sumptuous apartment on the Boulevard Espagne in 1978. Like other former soldiers in the movement, he was bitter about de Gaulle's betrayal, who, having previously given his word to keep Algeria within the French orbit, did an about-face and came out in favor of independence for the overseas provinces. In Salon's own words, "I killed and had others killed because of de Gaulle, and for that I could never forgive him." A phrase often heard from these champions of a lost cause is "c'est la parole donnée," or "I gave my word to the army of Algeria, to the Pieds Noirs, to the Francophile Muslims, that we would protect them, and we did not." The security situation in Algeria continued to deteriorate between the time when the Arabs first revolted in 1954 and the return to power of de Gaulle in 1958. The late André Roosevelt, a Pied Noir who was involved in the struggle, he took over Radio Alger during the putsch, recounted in his autobiography, The 11e Commandement, that before 1954, one could travel the back roads throughout the country in relative safety, but after 1954, such travel became highly perilous because of the risk of running into an FLN ambush. As a result of this climate of insecurity, agriculteurs who lived in the bloody countryside in Algeria began to pack up and move to the cities for refuge. A little known fact is that there was very little colonization in the Algerian countryside after World War II. The exodus to the cities had, by 1945, begun. The changing demographics of the countryside was also a factor in the FLN's decision to establish networks in Algeria's cities, on the assumption that a bomb exploding in a cafe in Algiers would attract more publicity than operations carried out in rural areas. Thus, you have two elements of the equation cited above, the return of de Gaulle plus the war, and de Gaulle's role in aggravating the crisis cannot be understated. The referendum in 1959-60 to determine Algeria's future contained three choices: association with France, integration with France, or outright independence. It will also be recalled that it was the failure of the basically civilian uprising in January 1960, the Barricades uprising led by Ortiz, and the subsequent collapse of the general's putsch that led to the creation of the OAS that was already being formed before the lights went out at the Forum. The OAS was the brainchild of two prominent activists who had been involved in Algerian politics since the outbreak of the war: Georges Sizini and Pierre Poujade. Sizini was what might be called today a political operative, a bête à penser, or the brains behind many of the extreme right-wing social movements which came to light after 1954. By contrast, Poujade, a local attorney and reserve parachute lieutenant, enjoyed his 15 minutes of fame when he set up a redoubt in the streets of Algiers in 1960 to support Ortiz's Barricades uprising. I met only once with Poujade, whose subsequent role in the OAS was, to put it accurately, succinct, in a cafe in the French provinces where he resided. I met with Sizini a number of times and conducted some in-depth interviews on his role in events in Algeria leading up to independence. At the time of our interviews, Sizini was living in a lavish hôtel particulier, or townhouse, on the Rue Saint-Lusky, in one of Paris's most exclusive neighborhoods, with his wife Marie-Antoinette Luciani, an attorney who had links to high-ranking right-wing politicians in the French government, including Michel Poniatowski, or poignat to his friends. Suzini was wealthy, and it was rumored that his wealth came mainly from a series of bank holdups that he engineered in Algeria before the advent of independence. It was said that Suzini fled Algeria after independence with millions of dollars in stolen funds. Suzini, despite his harmless appearance, one observer called him the méchant blond, or the skinny blonde guy, was one of the most feared men of the OAS. And even after leaving Algeria, Suzini was involved in several bank robberies in Europe and was also behind, allegedly, the torture slaying of the former OAS treasurer, Raymond Gorel, whose code name was Cimetière or Scimitar. And Gorel's crime, in the eyes of Suzini, was to have held back funds destined for OAS combatants on the run after the fall of French Algeria. But despite the life of crime that Suzini had allegedly embarked upon, he only spent a token number of years in prison. When I knew him, he had become an MD and a psychiatrist, specializing in mental health issues. But he gave me good quotes. Suzini is a brilliant speaker, and he spoke to me about the OAS with a certain objectivity, since he had been both an observer and a participant in a conflict. One example of his eloquence regarding life on the ground is worthwhile conveying to you. Suzini confided to me in the following words. A university professor is more suited to life underground than the most highly decorated soldier. War in the shadows requires a certain power of imagination, a taste for reading, a faith in what one is doing. Above all, a soldier's courage is physical. The risks he takes are all the more audacious when they are accompanied by the roll of drums and the blare of trumpets, as in the charge of the Light Brigade. But to be dressed as a civilian, to work for your country, to endure personal sacrifice and suffering, this training is more academic than military. Personally, I had enthusiasm for what I was doing. Danger was secondary. Clandestineness became a matter of habit. The OAS has been described by one writer as an uncooked pudding, and that are brought together under the same tent or roof, different groups with different ideologies, and included monarchists such as the above-mentioned Martel, the right-wing farmer who provided a safe house in the months following the collapse of the putsch, for Salon. And within the OAS, there were also fascists from Jeune Nation, or a young nation, who brandished the Celtic cross during the street demonstrations. There were former rank-and-file communists, like proletarian whites of Babelwed, who turned against the party when the party adopted an anti-imperialist stance and threw its support to the FLN. There were also legionnaire deserters for whom Algeria was home, as well as the NCOs and high-ranking officers who politically supported the fascist Pierre Poujade and who defended the colonial tradition to the end. Finally, there were those who joined the OAS because they believed that one should not be uprooted without a fight. Despite this ideological diversity, all of the operatives, small fry killers as well as high-ranking officers, were united by a common passion, the willingness to defend Algeria as an integral part of France. As former Colonel Jean Gaulle, who deserted in 1960 to join Ortiz at the Barricades, explained to me, "Nous avions tous la même tête. Nous portions tous la même cravate." We all had the same frame of mind. We all wore the same school tie, as it were. In brief, the resistance to the end of French Algeria, the most radical manifestation of defiance, which was the OAS, barely lasted a year from the collapse of the putsch in April 1961 until July 1962, when the results of a referendum revealed that the majority of citizens in France and Algeria decided overwhelmingly at the ballot box that enough was enough and that Algeria should be independent. But by this time, the OAS had already made plans to evacuate its fighters, who fled to various parts of Europe, one step ahead of the Gaullist barbouzes, the cause for which these citizen soldiers had fought and sacrificed was lost. And Algeria, one of the last outposts of the empire and the French colonial tradition, was henceforth in the hands of the Algerian FLN and its supporters. As has been said by a number of experts, including my good friend and colleague, William Zartman, the reasons for the OAS's defeat are obvious. First, the OAS was not able to rally to its side a significant number of groups or countries in France and elsewhere Unlike the FLN and the IRA, the OAS was isolated diplomatically. All things considered, it consisted, according to Jean-Marc Rouanet, an OAS veteran, of no more than 100 guys, 100 personnes à tout casser. Even its support among the Pieds Noirs was limited, whereas its support among the proletarian whites was almost unanimous and wholehearted. The bourgeoisie, throughout the struggle, maintained a cautious neutrality. In his autobiography, for example, Joe Ortiz, L'Oncle Joe, wrote that during the Barricades week, many Algérois were at the beach instead of at the barricades, manning the barricades. As noted above, no foreign power, even those sympathetic to the preservation of French Algeria, came to the aid of the OAS. Even Portugal, headed by the corporatist Salazar, corporatism, by the way, is plus ou moins, more or less, a synonym for fascism, kept its distance. The Republic of South Africa, which was implementing its own counter-revolution within the continent to maintain white minority rule, did not extend aid. In the words of Jean-Claude Perez, former head of information gathering and operations in the OAS, he confided to me, "Qu'est-ce que c'était l'OAS? Une minorité dans une minorité," a minority within a minority. A third reason the OAS failed is that the majority of voters in metropolitan France did not see it in their self-interest to maintain a standing army in Algeria of perhaps 500,000 men, which would have been required, in order to keep the overseas provinces within the French orbit. Although the army of Algeria had won a military victory over the FLN, the roots of rebellion remained. De Gaulle was aware of this, and thus, as the ultimate pragmatist, realized that French Algeria had, by the 1960s, become an anachronism and an impediment to relations with Francophone Africa. In view of the winds of change, Harold Macmillan's words, which swept across Africa after World War II, and with colonies falling like dominoes as a result, it would have been counterproductive to maintain Algeria as part of the metropole. De Gaulle had a grand dessein, a grand design, which was to create a counterpoise to the two superpowers, the USA and the USSR, by joining France to the interests of its former colonial possessions. Algeria under French rule would have stood in the way of this grand design. When you undertake a scholarly investigation of a counter-terrorist movement such as the OAS, you have a choice of methods. You can adopt a somewhat orthodox approach and conduct your research from the internet or by quote-unquote leafing through dusty tomes and quiet libraries. Or you can go out into the field and, using Shank's pony, meet and interview these former desperados who were still around after independence in 1962. I was fortunate in that when I began my interviews, many of the foot soldiers and leaders of the OAS, both civilian and military, were not only alive but available for interviews. All of them, even the most operational among them, had benefited from a blanket amnesty accorded in 1968 by de Gaulle. To quote an official of the Ministry of the Interior at that time, "We preferred to have these hungry wolves inside the country where they could be watched, rather than outside." Many within the movement had also written books, and it was possible to make contact with them through their publishers. Such was the case for former Generals Salon and Jouot, as well as Jean-Jacques Suzini, the former propaganda chief for the OAS. Otherwise, I was able to find them simply by looking them up in the local telephone directory. Such was the case for Jean-Claude Perez, the former head of information gathering and operations, who had resumed his medical practice after being amnestied, and who spoke to me at length between official appointments in his cabinet de médecin, or doctor's office, as well as later at the home of a friend, where we discussed Perez's role further while enjoying a fantastic collation washed down with Algerian pinard wine. Like Suzini, Perez was alleged to have fled Algeria just before the advent of independence with the magots, funds accumulated from bank holdups, and which he distributed among former combatants. Most of the booty, however, he kept for himself. And according to some of the former OAS gunmen, namely Gabillon Glade, whose picture you will see momentarily, many OAS veterans can never forgive Perez what he had done. When I began my field investigations in France, Spain, and Algeria, where the ex-combatants had resettled, the time was ripe. Barely 16 years had passed since Algeria had become independent, and memories were still fresh. The conflict was closer to us chronologically. My dissertation and books on the subject have an immediacy that would have been impossible to recreate in subsequent accounts of the war written years later. My goal in doing these in-depth interviews was not only to satisfy my own curiosity, but also to fill in the blanks, as it were, name names and connect specific OAS gunmen to specific operations. Thus, after careful checking and cross-checking, I was able to identify members of the OAS hit squad that carried out the executions at the social centers at Chateau Royal on the 15th of March 1962, in which, as noted above, the great Algerian writer Mouloud Ferroun, friend and former classmate of Albert Camus and Emmanuel Robles, perished, along with other notables. The OAS commando unit for this operation included as follows: Gabi Anglade, alias Silver-Haired Gabi L'Argenté, a former paratrooper who had fought the FLN in the bled, and upon returning to Algiers, joined the OAS when de Gaulle's intentions had become clear. Jean Martinez, a.k.a. Jeannot, a cafe owner and army veteran. Joritza, noted above, and Félicien Gardiola, also known as Kiki, an army veteran who had lost 7 members of his family to FLN terrorism, and was a taxi driver by day and a part-time OAS assassin by night. Likewise, I was able to track down and interview members of an OAS cell that left a booby-trapped car on the Algiers docks one day in March 1962, which, when the bomb exploded, killed over 60 Muslim stevedores. The operation was planned and carried out by a cell of the OAS, headed by Jacques Achard, a former prefect, and his adjoint, Claude Dupont and Jean-Paul Gras, both former paratroopers. Also involved in this operation were the following sharpshooters: Norbert Valls, Sauveur Bettini, Christian Moriconi, Gégé Garcia, who had provided the car, a certain Coco, and François Andugar, also known as Le Petit François. All of these operatives hailed from Algiers' working-class neighborhoods of Bab el-Oued and Orient-Marine. In addition to the above-mentioned OAS gunmen who participated in the bombing on the docks of Algiers, one should also mention the name of Rolandi Valls and Vincent Millet, aka Vincent Le Chauve. Exploding a booby-trapped car on the docks of Algiers, killing dozens of Muslim stevedores, as well as the mortar bombardment of the Place du Gouvernement, were heartless, immoral acts, indefensible under any circumstances. But for the OAS, which had the FLN attacking it on the one hand and the French government through its spooks and barbouzes on the other, such desperate acts carried out by desperate men appeared justified. In the words of François Andugar, who, when I went to interview him, was living in Alicante, Spain, and was the owner of a hardware store, his relation of that fateful day is as follows. We asked our patron, I think it was Achard, for the authorization to set off a bomb, and we got the green light to do so. But I wasn't alone. There was Coco, Sauveur, Norbert Valls, Rolandi Valls, and Claude Dupont. This was our squad. We had already done other things, but we were looking for the ideal spot to achieve the maximum impact. We knew, of course, that there would be many civilian casualties. I had some misgivings about that, but I also recalled that the FLN had done the same thing to us. We gave them a little bit of their own back, that's all. Rendez un peu la monnaie, c'est tout. The bombs set off in city buses, the ones set off at the Casino de la Corniche. They, the FLN, committed these things without regard for the loss of life. Marcel Ligier, a.k.a. Marcel Bazooka, demolitions expert and Indochina veteran, had nothing to do with this operation. Garcia handled everything. He came with a clock, detonator, and the bomb, and placed them in a shoebox, which he then placed in the car. He connected the fuse and left the car on the docks. There were no OAS snipers thereabouts to pick off the survivors of the blast. Absolutely not. We did this because the insurrection of Bab el-Oued had failed to materialize. We knew it was the end for us. We had our backs to the wall completely. We had the French army against us on one side and the FLN on the other. So we decided that, as a parting shot, finir pour finir, we would do as much harm as possible. As noted above, such military operations were not committed in a vacuum. In the defense of the actions of the OAS, Gaby Anglade, noted above, aka Gaby d'Argenté, expressed his bitterness in no uncertain terms. We were betrayed, that's all. We, the Pieds Noirs, were more French than the others. We survive here, but we don't live. We're not pariahs, but we have been treated as though we were. We revolted in Algeria, but that was understandable. One is not uprooted without a fight. The Delta Commandos were not killers, but ordinary citizens ready to die for a cause, the preservation of French Algeria. They were good people who were called upon to do things that they should not have been called upon to do. We were not marginal, but more sensitive to our country's fate than many of our contemporaries. It was an absurd war. What we, the Deltas, did, the Delta Commandos, that is to say, a 4-year-old child could have done. We were betrayed. The Algerian OAS tried also a number of times to assassinate de Gaulle because of their bitterness over his decision to give Algeria away to the FLN. Several attempts were made to bring him down when he was touring Algeria after his return to power in 1958, as has been indicated. And then also in France, once when he was being driven home to Colombe des Églises from the Élysée Palace. But all failed for various reasons. Perhaps, just perhaps, because even the OAS feared the consequences of regicide, of committing the ultimate. To summarize, the OAS, the most radical manifestation of defiance to de Gaulle's decision to decolonize in Algeria, ended with the approval of independence in July 1962. An independence that voters in France and Algeria approved overwhelmingly. Moreover, as noted above, support often broke down along class lines, with the proletarian whites supporting it in most cases unconditionally, but with the bourgeoisie keeping its distance from the struggle. As Roger de Gelbe, head of the Bureau d'Action et d'Opération, head of the Delta Commando groups, put it succinctly, la bourgeoisie, elle n'existe pas. The army of Algeria, whose support was indispensable to the preservation of French Algeria, was divided between the military adventurers, rogue elements who had deserted to join the OAS, and the majority of officers and NCOs who remained dans l'égalité, faithful to the Republic and to de Gaulle. It will be recalled that many officers of the Army of Algeria were also veterans of the resistance, of de Gaulle's resistance movement, les forces françaises libres, and their loyalty to the chief of state was unconditional. An anecdote often told is that one day de Gaulle asked Massu, former head of the 10th Paratroop Division, whose actions ended FLN terrorism in Algiers, "Comment ça va, Massu?" Massu's reply was, "Toujours con, toujours Gaulliste." "How are you doing, Massu?" said de Gaulle, and Massu's reply was, "Still stupid, still a Gaullist." In an interview with Pierre Montagnon, a veteran of the Premier Rep, or 1st Foreign Legion Paratroop Regiment, who deserted to join the OAS and then was captured and amnestied with his comrades in arms in 1968, the following question arose. Why did decolonization proceed relatively smoothly in other Francophone colonies in Africa compared to Algeria, which became the killing ground in the years preceding independence? In my view, the answer is as follows. First, Algeria was never considered to be a mere colony or protectorate, but an extension of France proper, divided into départements similar to our states of the Union. To amputate a part of the national territory was, for many Frenchmen, inadmissible. Second, the French settler population in Algeria was over 1 million, and as past history has shown, resistance to decolonization has always been proportional to the number of expatriate whites who settled roots there. When you look at a map of Africa, after the Berlin Conference of 1881, you see that in the race for colonies, the regions that attracted the highest number of white or European settlers were those where the weather was salubrious, healthy, the earth was fertile, and the country was rich in minerals and other natural resources. Thus, countries like Rhodesia, South Africa, Kenya, among others, attracted large numbers of immigrants from Europe who resisted the mother country's decision to hand power over to the native majority. Likewise for Algeria, which had a lovely coast, fertile land, excellent for farming, in an ideal climate, also as the oil fields of Hassi Messaoud attest to, a source of great mineral wealth. In French possessions, formerly French possessions such as Senegal, Guinea-Conakry, Mauritania, among others, where the climate is not so healthy and death from malaria and other tropical diseases was a common occurrence, there were fewer European settlers, and therefore the resistance to decolonization was much less intense. Third, in Algeria there was a clash of temperaments and religions, that of the Pieds-Noirs, whose forebears came from Europe and were Christian by and large, and the Arabs, or native Algerians, the overwhelming majority of whom were Muslim. Islam is a religion that must be predominant wherever it has been implanted. Moreover, the Pieds-Noirs are not a people that believes in compromise. They either love you or they hate you. There is no middle road, at least in my view. Thus, when draft bills were proposed in the National Assembly to allow Algerian Muslims to become French citizens without forcing them to renounce their religion, these bills were thwarted by the French Algeria lobby that preferred to keep the Muslim majority in Algeria in an inferior position. Algerians were often referred to routinely by the Pieds-Noirs as melon, melonhead, figuier, fig tree, falouse, terrorist, bicot, and so forth, to indicate that they will not in any way be equal of the Pieds-Noirs. One also saw in the Pieds-Noirs frame of mind traces of Manichaeism, the notion that si je n'ai pas tort, je dois avoir raison. If I am not wrong, I must be right. An extremist outlook that made it difficult to compromise. Finally, one must take into account the lack of honesty shown both by the politicians in France throughout the waning years of the Fourth Republic and the first years of the Fifth Republic, as well as by the pro-French Algeria lobby in the National Assembly, both of which perpetuated the myth, which included prime ministers such as Pierre Poujade and Guy Mollet, among others, that Algeria would always remain French. De Gaulle, like Hans Orat, as his detractors referred to him, was equally culpable, since, as noted above, upon his return to power in 1958, his first act was to go to Algeria and reassure the Pieds-Noirs, declaring, "Vive l'Algérie française," thus stirring false hopes among the beleaguered Pieds-Noirs, as well as the Francophile Muslims, that France would protect them. Regarding the betrayal of the Pieds-Noirs and pro-French Muslims or Francophile Muslims by successive governments in France, Nobel Valls, one of the most lively OAS gunmen, told me in the course of an interview, "We should have come to France sooner," from Algeria. "If they had explained to us what would happen, 3/4 of the Pieds-Noirs of my generation would have left. We would have come to France. In Algeria, we were cut off. On vivait en vase clos. In France, we have discovered a number of things. I think that all we did, risking our lives, was for nothing, because, well, Algeria became independent anyway. It would have been better to tell us at the outset that Algeria was lost, to tell us that it was all over. Things would have been different." The regrets, the remorse of Valls, one of the most efficient of the OAS gunmen, were echoed by many of his comrades in arms, as well as by the pro-French Muslims, the Francophile Muslims, who after independence were left unprotected by a French government which they had risked their lives to defend. The Pieds-Noirs were able to leave before the country was turned over to the FLN in July 1962, and leave they did, forming one of the largest mass exoduses in modern history. But the pro-French Muslims, the Francophile Muslims, had to remain in Algeria. They had no other choice, and they paid a heavy price for their loyalty to France. Now, I am sure that some of you assembled here tonight wonder what relevance does a colonial conflict fought a half-century ago, a war that France lost, not militarily but diplomatically, have to do with events occurring in the Middle East and the Maghreb today. In my view, the Algerian War is relevant to us today for the following reasons. First, the conflict in Algeria dealt with the coexistence of several different communities: Jews, Christians, Muslims, coastal Arabs versus mountain Berbers, all of whom were different in terms of culture, language, and religious denomination. France failed to bring these disparate groups together. Thus, tolerance of the other and acceptance of differences in the other raised serious problems for the French authorities. As noted above, during the Third Republic, French citizenship was extended to Algerian Jews, thanks to the Décret Crémieux, but not to native Algerians, thereby creating a rift between the two communities that was never to be healed. Along the same lines, it was French policy in Algeria to favor one Arab community over another. In other words, to jouer la carte Kabyle, favor the Berber minority from the Kabylia, the interior, versus Arabs living along the coast. Thus, France's policy throughout the occupation of Algeria was to divide and conquer in order to better maintain control of the country as a whole. A strategy followed, it should be said, by other colonial powers throughout the continent during the period of the new imperialism. In addition, numerous attempts by the National Assembly in France, as indicated above, to enfranchise native Algerians and extend citizenship to them because of their sacrifices in World Wars I and II were relentlessly thwarted by the influential Pied Noir lobby in the Assembly. Such an intolerance of the other finds modern-day parallels in the Middle East. In, for example, the reluctance of Israel, the state of Israel, to reach a modus vivendi with the Palestinians on an independent state, and the material support, for example, given by Israel to the Christian Phalangists in their military campaign against the Palestinians living in the refugee camps of Sabra and Shatila in the early 1980s in Lebanon. The IDF, or the Israeli Defense Force, not only armed the Christian Phalangist gunmen in their attacks on the refugee camps, but were observed shooting flares in the skies over the camp to further help the killers. What was this except an example of intolerance of the other carried to the 10th degree? Second, the failure of successive governments in Algeria after independence to reach even modest development goals, due in part to weak economic growth compounded by an exploding birth rate, has led tens of thousands of Algerians to emigrate to the West, a mass exodus that can be considered a precursor to the north-south migration occurring throughout Africa today. One example, when I was in Agadez some years ago, a desert outpost in Niger about 800 miles north of the capital, I witnessed daily trucks, camions with human cargo, Africans leaving for the Mediterranean across the sandy wastes of the Sahara and thence to Europe to start a new life. Agadez was the jumping-off point. Regarding the disillusionment felt by many Algerians whom I spoke to about their own government after independence, I recall the words of one university professor whose cri de coeur, impassioned cry was echoed by many of his countrymen. Quote, "Disenchantment, there is no other way to describe Algeria today. What have we done with our independence? Who could have imagined that Algeria is where it is today? Injustice, misery, corruption on a large scale. The living have betrayed the dead, that is to say the brave fighters, the Jundi, the Mujahideen, who sacrificed so much for the independence of the country. I am less bitter towards France, the former colonial power, than I am toward my own government, which has betrayed the ideals of the revolution. Our parents sacrificed themselves so that we could have a better country, a just one, without humiliation. Those who are in power now are the new colons, the new colonizers. We have gained our independence, but we are not yet free." Another personal footnote. Having worked in the realm of international cooperation in West Africa for a number of years, and having known Algeria at one point like the inside of my pocket, I can affirm that the problem of disillusionment among many Africans is not unique to Algeria, but is general, at least in those countries where I was assigned. Finally, the Algerian War is relevant to the here and now because it was a prime example of the guerre révolutionnaire, the guerre moderne, in which the central strategy was terrorism, employed by both the Algerian FLN as well as the OAS, and whose essential weapon was the bomb and the automatic pistol. The tactics employed by both the Algerian OAS and the FLN find their parallel today in the actions of Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, Mali and elsewhere, where the main goal is not to acquire territory, as in a conventional war, but their goal is political in nature, to break the spirit of those whom they seek to terrorize. In Algeria, the targets of FLN terrorism were not only the French settlers and the Francophile Muslims, but the vast mass of Algerians who had come to fear the terror of the FLN more than the law. It is a little-known fact that French casualties in the war numbered roughly 35,000. Yet more than 1 million Algerians were killed by the FLN, mainly to compel others to fall into line. One egregious example was the internecine quarrel between the Messaristes, followers of Messali Hadj, and the FLN, which resulted in the massacre of an entire village of 250 inhabitants in the region of Mulhouse in 1957, as well as the killing spree undertaken by an Algerian FLN leader, Amir Houcha, chief of the Wilayat 3, the 3rd district in Algeria. The FLN had divided Algeria into wilaya, or military districts, in the Kabylie, in which more than 3,000 Algerians were killed. In the case of Amir Houcha, he was in a sense the victim of a campaign of intoxication and manipulation initiated by the French army, and which campaign or strategy was called la bleuite, and for those who are not acquainted with the word, it's spelled B-L-E-U-I-T-E. Amir Houcha, who is considered today, ironically, to be a national hero, had been convinced that many of his soldiers and officers had become double agents for the French. Some of the enhanced interrogation techniques which he employed and used on his fellow countrymen in order to extract confessions included what was called at the time l'hélicoptère, in which the suspect was hoisted on ropes above a fire and then lowered into the fire, roasted like a méchoui. Another method of enforcing discipline among the mass of Algerians was to forbid them to play dominoes, one of their favorite pastimes, smoke, or even listen to the radio, Radio Alger, under pain of having their noses and ears cut off. By contrast, according to the above-mentioned Jean-Claude Perez, head of information gathering and operations for the OAS never tortured anyone. The extent of Muslim on Muslim violence during the Algerian War has never received the attention it merited from historians. In another example of historical mimetism, just as radical Islam was a major threat to French rule in Algeria a half-century ago, likewise today it is more than a national problem, it is an international problem. If terrorism remains a major problem in the world today, likewise are the methods of interrogation used by, for example, Massou's 10th Paratroop Division during the Battle of Algiers. The use of the GGN, or electric shot, or the use of electrodes on a suspect to oblige him to talk, as well as la noyade simulée, or waterboarding. Both methods were in use 50 years ago in Algeria and are still used today by state terror networks all over the world. Thanks for listening. I hope that this inside account of the anguish of the final days of French Algeria and the role of social movements therein has broadened your horizons and given you insight into the fanaticism of both the Algerian FLN, which sought to free the country from French rule, and the OAS, which sought to keep Algeria within the French orbit. The war was marked on both sides by tit-for-tat savagery. As one OAS veteran remarked to me, "Moi je te tue, toi tu me tues." I kill you, you kill me. But to reprise the words of Gabillon Blad, noted above, the former paratrooper who became head of a Delta Commando unit in the OAS, it was an absurd war. Muslims fired upon Europeans, yet the two had been friends before the war. As a famous journalist, Jean-Baptiste Gare, wrote in one of his epigrams, "Plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose." The more it changes, the more it stays the same. History repeats itself, but perhaps not in always quite the same way. C'est à vous de juger. It is up to you to decide. Since I have, in the course of this intervention, raised a certain number of points that all of you may not agree with, I will be delighted to answer any questions you might have. Thank you.
Nous avons fidèlement nous nettoyer, et nous avons au cœur slayings que nous voulons porter au réserve, de bon amour à notre santé. Et si quelqu'un venait à y toucher, nous serions là pour mourir accepter, la tête en haut, à nos amours, pour le pays, pour la patrie, pour les Gaulois, c'est nous les Africains, de tous les horizons de France, groupés sur le sol africain, nous faisons pour la délivrance, et quand nous sauvera demain, en avant, en avant, en avant. C'est nous les Africains qui revenons de loin, nous menons des colonies pour sauver la patrie. Nous avons quitté par pour nettoyer, et nous avons au cœur une âme inséparable que nous voulons porter au réserve, le bon amour de notre France entière. Et si quelqu'un venait à y toucher, nous serions là pour mourir accepter, la tête en haut, à nos amours, pour le pays, pour la patrie, pour les Gaulois, c'est nous les Africains. Et lorsque finira la guerre, nous reviendrons dans nos gourmets, dans nos gourmets, le cœur joyeux et l'âme fière, d'avoir libéré le pays, en criant, en chantant, en avant. C'est nous les Africains qui revenons de loin, nous menons des colonies pour sauver la patrie. Nous avons quitté par nous nettoyer, et nous avons au cœur une âme inséparable que nous voulons porter au réserve, le bon amour de notre France entière. Et si quelqu'un venait à y toucher, nous serions là pour mourir accepter,